Thank you. Thanks, Jenny, and thanks to the office, too, for organizing this opportunity. I'm really excited that you're here because this is my first opportunity, actually, to share my research with you and actually with anybody outside of Scotland. So I feel like it's like a North American debut and we need like a red carpet or something, I don't know, for all of you to come down the red carpet and hear about this research. I'm going to start, first of all, with a video. And it's a video of Jarlath Henderson, who is, I think he's an incredible musician. He's a doctor, he's a surfer. He's also the youngest BBC Young Trad Musician Award winner ever. And while you're watching the video, I'd like you to look at it through the lens of sort of unpacking it and going, what parts are traditional and what parts are contemporary? Okay, so while you're watching it, it's great, I love it. I might dance in the corner. But think about this while you're watching him and try and pick out the pieces that you're hearing and that you're seeing that are really contemporary and other pieces that you kind of feel are traditional. You may or may not know that they're traditional, but just kind of think about that while you're watching. And then we'll talk about it. Okay.
Courting is a pleasure between my love and I, and it's down in yonder valley I will meet her by and by. It's down in yonder valley, she is my heart's delight, and it's with you, lovely Molly, I will stay till the broad daylight. Going to church on Sunday, my love, she passed me by, and I knew her mind was altered by the roving of her eye. I knew her mind was altered by a lad of high degree. Oh, Molly, lovely Molly, your looks have wounded me. I then took out a bottle and I held it in my hand, saying, here's a glass, dear Molly, for our courtship is at an end. So is your glass, dear Molly, drink the bottle dry for me, for there are 10 guineas wagered that married will ne'er be. Oh, never court a wee girl with a dark and a roving eye. Just kiss her and embrace her, never tell her the reason why. Just kiss her and embrace her till you cause her heart to yield. For a faint-hearted soldier never gained a battlefield. Oh, farewell, Ballymoney, and to County Antrim too. Likewise, farewell, dear Molly, I will bid you a fond adieu. America lies far away,
So did you, were you thinking about what we just talked about? Yeah, there's lots, there were elements in there, right? So there were the traditional elements. What were some of the traditional elements that you saw? I'm just going to turn on the lights. Just shout them out. What are some of the traditional elements that you think you saw?
The fiddle and the whistle.
Yeah, who said that? I can't see. What are you? Yeah, the fiddle, the whistle, the beat. Yeah, absolutely. The
melody.
Sorry?
The melody.
The melody.
Was and it wasn't.
Yeah, yeah, it was at moments, was it? And then it turned into something really contemporary, and then came back to that. There's like that leitmotif going on. Yeah, there was something else here. The lyrics, yeah, you could see courting is a pleasure. The word courting, we don't really use that anymore. Talked about a soldier, a roving eye, Molly, yeah. So there was this melding of contemporary with current and old, right? So there was this sort of mashing all together. And so what Gàidhealtachd has done is he's taken what was a song that was maybe contemporary years and years and years ago, and he pulled it into the current day. And then he kind of mashed it around with some contemporary music and contemporary plugged in instruments. And then, yeah, I know, you'd like it, right? Yeah. I was saying to Sharon, I knew she was going to like this. And he's created a product for sale. Really, that's what he's done as a musician. So it's not unlike what I'm wearing today. So what I'm wearing today is, it's a ruana, and it's a contemporary version of an old female dress. It's the same thing. We're taking what's happened in the past and pulling it forward into the today and then creating that product. So another way to look at it, and today we're going to be looking through the historical lens. So another way to look at it is what John Tosh talks about. And he's from Roehampton University in the UK. And he's written a book about why history matters. He says, how can what is not only dead and gone, but remote and sometimes alien have any practical bearing on today's world? And I think that's a really relevant question for where we are at Royal Roads. So I thought I'd pull that up. And here's his answer. At the very least, studying history allows us to evaluate our world from another position, and thus to entertain other possibilities for the world's present and future development. What we aspire to, how we organize our society, and how we tackle its problems may all be differently conceived when we turn our attention to the varied answers which have been given in the past. So I think that's really relevant for us at Royal Roads University because, again, you're just looking at history from a different perspective and going, hey, how does that work today? How does that influence what we do today? So that's the kind of lens that we're going to be looking through in this presentation. And I'm going to be talking about some research that I did over the past year and a half on innkeeping in the Highlands and Islands of Scotland, 1790 to 1840. This is what I'm just going to pull this up. Here we go, here we go. And there. I'll let you know a little bit about the spark or the inspiration behind the research, how that came to be. We'll get our bearings just to make sure we know kind of what time frame we're in, what geography we're in, that sort of thing. We'll look at how inns themselves, where they opened, how that all happened, how that kind of exploded during this time period. We will meet an actual innkeeper from 1832. Her name is Janet. She totally existed. We'll look at her innkeeping operations. What was her day like? What happened every day with her? Then I'll talk a bit about the findings as a result of that research, so what I have concluded, and then how we can bring that research from the history and looking at the past, bring it into today, and how does it kind of impact our thinking for today, and where can we go with this now that it's been done. And then if there's time, we'll do a bit of postscript at the end about family trees and tromping around in Scotland. It's a 5-minute story. It's just kind of interesting to pull it back to today. So that's what we're going to do. Just a bit about the spark behind the research. I've been doing it for about a year and a half. I think research just never ends, right? Like it just, you start and then you try and stop and you just can't. It's like an illness. But eventually you just have to cut it off and write the darn thing. And that's kind of where I'm at. So I started it about a year and a half ago with my master's at the University of the Highlands and Islands in Scotland. It came about as a result of a paper that I did, a really small paper. It was for a course. And it was looking at women in the Highlands and Islands through the eyes of someone else. And I had chosen Dorothy Wordsworth and her diary. So Wordsworth must be a familiar name, right? Where do you think that familiarity comes in? Dorothy Wordsworth is related to William Wordsworth, yep. Who is friends of, does anybody else know? Samuel Taylor Coleridge. They're all buddies. So they were obviously in England, and at one point in the early 1800s, the three of them, pals, decided to travel into Scotland and on their leisure time. And Dorothy writes about her experiences in this diary. So I read this diary, and all through it were social history references, her observations to what women did in the Highlands and Islands during this time. And I pulled up all of these references to innkeepers, and they were women. I thought, okay, that's kind of interesting. And my supervisor said to me, you know, there might be something there. You should really kind of pick apart maybe innkeeping. That could be a really interesting dissertation topic. And I said, okay. But she said, you know, you're probably just going to know about innkeeping. There'll maybe a little section on women, because there's not a lot on women out there in terms of primary resources. But why don't you try? And that was Dr. Elizabeth Ritchie, I have to say her name, because she was like amazing. So I did. And I looked at the research, and this is a list. You know, sometimes you can actually put all of the researchers on one list, and this is essentially all of them. There are a few, probably it's missing maybe about 6, let's say, of all the researchers who have done anything on inns in Scotland. And what I found was there was a lot to do with location, a lot to do from a traveler's perspective, a lot to do with specific occupations that would go to an inn, like drovers, people who drove cattle down to markets. A lot on the inn buildings themselves, architecture, that sort of thing. Lots on whiskey. Where do you drink whiskey? At an inn. And a bit on urban innkeeper experiences. But really what was missing was the whole Highlands and Islands part. And the Highlands and Islands we'll go into a little bit on so you can get your bearings. But it's much more rural. So what I started to look at was, there's some great research here, but it's all done from a slightly different perspective, and it didn't put the innkeeper in the center. And there really wasn't anything on innkeepers and what they did. So there was a lot on travelers as the center of the research, with a little bit about inns, a little bit about location, a little bit about innkeeper and landowner. And I thought, okay, so what happens if we take, say, a James Hunter model and we flip it? And instead of putting the traveler in the center of the research, why don't we instead put the innkeeper in the center of the research? So it becomes a bottom-up sort of view of social history. So I did that. I decided, okay, I'm going to put the innkeeper in the center, and that's going to be my focus. And then I looked at all of the other research, and it was really urban versus rural, and there was a lot on urban, a lot of urban research, relatively speaking. And that makes sense, right? It's a city, there's lots of resources, you know, the newspapers are several pages long, there's lots to view, and from a research perspective, it's fairly easy to pick it up. And I thought, well, what happens if we kind of flip that model and we do something slightly different and we put rural in the center instead? So I thought, I want to look at innkeepers from a rural perspective and see what their daily lives are like. So in order to do that, I needed to go beyond Dorothy Wordsworth's diary, and I needed to actually start to build out what that experience was like being an innkeeper. And so I pulled together things like maps, things like other diaries from other travelers, things like receipts, newspaper articles, anything and everything I could get my hands on, especially, you'll see the bottom left, statistical accounts of Scotland. If you're doing any sort of research in this time period, those are parish reports that are taken about roughly 35 to 40 years apart. So it gets a really good view of social history at one stage, early 1790s, and then another really good view of social history in the same townships about 35 or 40 years later. And so I took all of that and I pulled it all together to try and figure out, well, what the heck did innkeepers do? Where were they? Where were inns? What was happening at that time? So let's look at our bearings. This is actually a map that is of the time period, 1798, roughly. It's really hard to see. It's like, I can't even tell you half of those, well, I probably could tell you half of those places, but it's a bit hard to see. So what I've done is, just so we can get our bearings for today, is pulled this. It's a little easier to look at. This is a map of Scotland, and I've added in there Glasgow and Edinburgh. Has anybody been to Glasgow or Edinburgh? Okay, so you have an idea of where that is. Inverness is the top star. And what you're looking at actually is an elections map for the Highlands and Islands area. So this is a contemporary map, even though we're talking about 1790. But this just gives you an idea of where you should be thinking about when you're looking at this research and the results from it. So what I'd like you to focus on is the red part. The pink part, Glasgow, Edinburgh, the borders along the bottom, which is, with borders with England on the bottom, obviously. All of the pink part, not really talking about that. All the red part, talking about that part. Okay, so, and that's called the Highlands and Islands. There is, you would have seen in the notice for this talk, that word that starts with a G on the top, that's Gaelic. So if you were like me, the first time I saw that word, I went, what the heck? I don't even know how to pronounce that. But how you say it in English is Gàidhealtachd. So the Gàidhealtachd area is the Highlands and Islands area. So it's all we need to know for today. It's basically the red bit. There is a little bit of a line on the pink, and that's just to indicate that the time period that we're talking about, it was a little bit more down into the pink than it kind of is today on the electoral map. How you can also think about it is it's similar to Francophone culture. Okay, so this is talking about a certain cultural area. It's kind of like Francophone. There's no real border for Francophone people. We know a lot of them live in Quebec, but a lot of them live elsewhere too. And Gàidhealtachd culture is like that. It's language-based, Gaelic, but it has a real culture to it, not unlike Francophone culture. So if you think about it that way, it's kind of who we're talking about. Highlands and Islands, it's on that part of the country. It'll give you a sense of where we're at. Let's also look at the time frame. So 1790 to 1840 is basically a 50-year period. There were all kinds of stuff happening with really popular fiction. Sir Walter Scott was pumping out books, and it was like Harry Potter of the day, right? Like everybody was reading it, and it was so exciting. And he wrote a lot about the Romanticism in the Highlands, and people thought that was really cool. I thought, oh, I might want to go there. Check that out. He's on the left there. On the bottom is that little sort of cartoon picture. That is Samuel Johnson and Boswell. Johnson and Boswell were friends, and prior to this time period that we're talking about, they traveled into the Highlands, and they both wrote. And Boswell loved Johnson, and Johnson had the biggest ego on the planet. So if you ever want to read travel, like real travel diaries, read the ones from Boswell and Johnson, because I don't think they meant to be hysterical, but I find them laugh out loud funny. So they had gone into the Highlands and Islands, which was really untraveled at that point, and they had become celebrities. So there was this sort of celebrity halo that went along with them. And again, people wanted, oh, let's go and see what Boswell and Johnson are doing, or did. There was also Ossian. There were these mythic poems of Ossian that were apparently Gaelic poems from years gone by. There was myth that was associated with that. Again, it was like something to get people interested in going north from England into the Highlands and Islands. And there were lots of wars on the continent during this time. So people didn't want to go south. They didn't want to go into France. They didn't want to go into Spain. That's not a good thing. Let's stay away from that. So this actually encouraged people to go north into the Highlands and Islands on their leisure time. Also at the same time, there were changes in transportation, which really helped alleviate some of the problems with traveling in rural areas that have bad roads and don't have bridges and don't have canals. And Thomas Telford on the left built a ton of roads and bridges. And he also built a canal or two. And that helped as far as transportation was concerned. Henry Bell, the guy on the right, he created the first steamship to go from a public transportation standpoint into the north. That was called the Comet. And so suddenly we had these much improved roads. we had bridges, we had canals, we had boats that you could actually go on and buy a ticket on and get somewhere. So the transportation was getting easier and easier, which was also helping people to travel in the Highlands and Islands. So as a result of all this stuff, like popular fiction, people coming up north, not wanting to go down onto the continent where there was unrest, all of the roads and canals that were being put in place, it helped people to travel more into the Highlands and Islands and around the Highlands and Islands. So not only were you getting more and more travelers coming in, or starting to, you were also getting people who were just doing their daily work, traveling more and more and more. Their sort of sphere, their work sphere of where they were working was expanding. So as I was doing this research and looking at all of those pieces that I showed you earlier, the diaries and maps and receipts and everything else, I was starting to put together what this story looked like. And I discovered that there were essentially two types of people that were traveling at that time. And the research up until this point has really focused on the leisure travelers. So that was certainly there. There were gentry class, leisure travelers who had time, just like Dorothy Wordsworth and William Wordsworth, and they were coming into the Highlands and Islands. But there were also people at work who were also just going about their daily job, their daily lives, and they were migrating within the country, and they were staying at inns. And this was everything from priests to excisemen, tax collectors, drovers, government official, military, you name it. So it really started to, as I was doing the research, it just started to build out the story of, you know, it's not just about the leisure traveler, it's about people at work too. As well, in the research, it was really obvious there were kind of two places that people stayed in. One is residents who were there started to open their doors to these travelers. And by opening doors, it might be their home, it might be a sheep hut, it might be a cave that someone points to and says, here, you can stay here. It could almost be anything. They started to see this opportunity. And travelers could also stay in inns built by landowners. So to consider this, at that time, and still actually in many ways, which is a whole other conversation, at that time, you couldn't own your property. You couldn't own your home. You were a tenant. The people who owned the property were landowners, and they had a whole heck of a lot of money, and they owned a whole swath of land, each one of them. And they were trying to make money off of their land. So one of the ways that they did this was opening inns. And here's a quote from the Parish report that talks about Lord Breadalbane's estate. And I'll just read it out to you. Nowhere in the Highlands has more attention been paid to the accommodation of the traveller than on the property of Lord Breadalbane. And that's him on the right there. In a line of public road of about 90 miles in length, extending from Inverary to Perth, good inns with suitable offices are built at proper stages and kept in repair at considerable expense by his lordship, namely at Dalmally, Taindrum, Killin, Kenmore, and Amory. So what's interesting about this quote is that Lord Breadalbane's estate, and you remember that map, the red bit? So his estate's kind of in the middle. So if you were to get from one end on the west side of the country to the other end, the left side of the country, in and about the middle, you're going to have to go through his property. So what he did on this major road is he created and built inns all the way along. Isn't that an interesting way to make some money? He obviously saw the opportunity with travelers. So some of these inns still exist. I've actually stayed in the Kenmore Inn. That is a massive complex. It absolutely exists. It's fantastic. So it's worth going. And Amory we're going to talk a bit about later because that's connected to Janet, the innkeeper that I mentioned at the very beginning. So they saw this as well, that the landowners were building inns in strategic locations in order to house all of these travelers and take advantage of that. So over this 50-year time period, especially in this 35 years between the two parish reports that I was talking about earlier, there was a massive increase in numbers of inns because all of these people were starting to come north and start to travel more within the country itself. So here are just some examples. In 35 years, Lewis and Harris, these are islands on the western side of the country. went from 0 to 8 inns. These are small islands, so that's fairly significant. Skye, has anybody been to Skye? Yeah, so it's fairly big, but I mean, going from 2 inns to 14 is pretty huge for the size of it. Sutherland went from 2 to 21. Sutherland is a massive area. So that may have not been as significant. Certainly that's a lot. They were going through clearances at the time, so if anybody knows any of the clearances narrative, that was certainly, it was happening all over, but there was a lot happening in Sutherland at that time. Regardless though, going from 2 to 21 is certainly significant. And Ross and Cromarty, in those areas, in those parishes that reported 0, in those parishes that reported 0 inns at the beginning of this period, they went from 0 to 42, which is an incredible spike in the number of inns that were there. And what I'm reporting on here is where inns were actually recorded. There were lots of places where the inns would not, no one would have written down there was an inn here. You know, so this is based on available data. So my assumption and my guess is it was actually quite a bit higher than this during this time period. So you can see if we plot the inns out on the left, that's the beginning of the period. On the right, that's the end of the period. So you can see visually then how they increased over time and in what areas. So this increased too. What else do you think increased? If inns are increasing, I'm going to look at my hotel people. If inns are increasing, what else is increasing? Yes, absolutely, employment and services, right? Services. Okay, so this is happening. Rentals. Suddenly inns are renting horses, carriages, and boats. Why are they renting horses? Why would you be renting horses? Anybody a horse person? Equestrian? Yeah. Brian's going like this. Yeah. The horses only last for so long. You can only ride them for so long. They need rest, right? So you would ride your horse or be in a carriage, go to the stop, and then that horse would stay. Get on the next horse, go to the next stop. That horse would stay. Get on the next one. It's the only way you could get up north. Think about it, right? Carriages and boats, for sure. Souvenirs. There's evidence of souvenirs. Cairngorm stones. So Cairngorm Mountains, if anyone's gone there, is very much a tourist area in Scotland. There's evidence of innkeepers taking Cairngorm stones, who knows exactly what they are, they could have been anything, and actually selling those to travelers that were there. Tour guides. Interesting, right? You have travelers coming into this area, into an area that's Gàidhealtachd. Remember we talked about the Gàidhealtachd, Gaelic language, Gaelic culture. A lot of people up there at that time did not speak English, but you have a lot of English travelers coming into that area. So the innkeepers hired some people who knew how to speak English and Gaelic to be interpreters and to be guides. Printed material. There's evidence of brochures. Like, who knew? You know, when you think about it, it's not that far off of what we're doing today. So there were brochures and guides. I've seen evidence of guides being in the Loch Lomond area, what to do when you're in the area, that kind of thing. And they would often be distributed through the inns as a distribution network. Food and beverage. Food and beverage is interesting. There's been a lot of historical research that's been done that says over and over and over again that food was meager, there wasn't a lot available, and I would argue absolutely against that. I have data like you would not believe on the variety of food that travelers were served. They were served meager scraps of whatever the family had, for sure. But as well, I have reams of data that shows that people were rolling out the door. They were just, you know, Scottish hospitality being what it was, they were just overflowing with food. And of all different kinds. And you can see actually a change over time from what they feel is appropriate to as more and more travelers come and travelers say, oh, I want this, do you have that? They're responding to this need and their requests. Whiskey, there was a lot of illicit whiskey distilling at that time. And that was it was one of the ways where inns made money, innkeepers made money, was through distilling whiskey. It was actually better than the stuff that was legal. Illicit whiskey was better than illegal whiskey at that time, in terms of taste. And they had takeaway, or as we would say in North America, takeout. And things like, you know, they want lunch, so the innkeeper makes them cooks them a grouse, and away they go. Gives them some apples. That's their takeaway. So we saw that. Services, absolutely. Stabling of horses, that was actually mandatory. So if you opened an inn, you had to have a stable. If you didn't have a stable, you had to have a relationship with someone in the community that actually had a stable. So I've seen evidence of travelers coming in with their horse, going to an inn, the inn doesn't have a stable, and the men or the ostlers take the horse down to the pub because the pub has a stable. Servants were hired, absolutely, we see that, especially family members too. Catering off-site and entertainment. I've seen evidence of Neil Gow, who, if you know anything about Scottish music, he's like a legend fiddle player. Amazing, died years ago obviously, but I have evidence of him being hired for a gentry class family to entertain them at an inn. And newspaper advertising started to rack up, right? Come to my inn, it's the best inn. So all of that increased. So you can imagine, think of it from an economic standpoint. Think of it from an economic standpoint. There's lots of relationships happening here, lots of money being made, lots of people relying on each other to be sustainable in their communities. This is wanted to show you Sarah Murray. Sarah was a female traveler. She kind of comes off as if she's traveling on her own. She's English, right? Traveling on her own through the Highlands and Islands, and in fact she didn't travel on her own because she was gentry class, so she had people with her to help her. She doesn't really talk about them too much. But she talks about one of the places that she found where someone had just opened their door because there was no inn available. And she says, I found this space, a miserable hut on a moor, bare of everything but stones. Mrs. McCrae hooked up a blanket to screen me from public view. They put a pair of lily-white sheets upon the bed, but notwithstanding, I determined not to take off my clothes nor unpack my bedding, but lie down in my great coat and traveling hood. You can imagine, right? She's freaking out. She's like, oh, I don't want to touch anything. Interestingly, in this quote, the lily-white sheets, over and over and over again, we see the reference to sheets being really a very good quality. Does anybody know the reason why we might see that over and over and over again? Women spun. Spinning was just a way that women made money in the Highlands and Islands. So they would spin and they would have lovely sheets. So without fail, I've seen evidence over and over and over again about how wonderful the sheets were. The rest of the place may be marginal, but the sheets were good. But here we see, I've highlighted there Mrs. McCrae. So through this research, I started to see these female innkeepers sort of pop up. And I started to track them because I thought, I can't keep track of any of these people. So I started to track them, and sure enough, I came up with over 60, and eventually I just stopped. It was like ridiculous, to the point of going, yeah, there are a ton of women, all of whom are innkeepers. I have over 60 that I've tracked, all of whom are different. So I began to realize that there were women innkeepers, not just male innkeepers, which I think is very significant because I think we think people who are managing businesses, it's easy to think that they're men. And what I was finding is women were everywhere in terms of innkeeping. So here I plotted them. There are also known widows. I only have about 5 or 6 known widows for sure, but just because we don't know that they're widows doesn't mean that they weren't, right? But certainly widowhood was a way into innkeeping. So then I plotted them against all the inns, and look, hey, the pattern's the same. So my conclusion was there were a lot of women innkeepers, a lot of female innkeepers. They were all over the place, as you can see. So why women? I started to ask, like, why? What would make, why not men? Because we know the men were there. We see the men. But why so many women innkeepers? Well, they commercialized their domestic tasks. They had choice. They had a lot of skill. There were a lot of travelers showing up at the door. They're like, hey, you know what? You need bed and food and whiskey. I can do that. So that's what they did. They commercialized their domestic tasks. They also had an ability as females to provide a calm atmosphere. Now this sounds a bit ridiculous, but I have seen it over and over and over again, where the landowners specifically looked for women. Because you can imagine a lot of people traveling at that time were men, and they had a mix of men of different ranks, different income, and whiskey. So you put all that together, might be a bit of a problem. The landowners didn't want any problem. They didn't want the police involved. They just wanted everything to be calm. They just wanted the money, right? So they hired women, and they specifically looked for women because women maintained their reputations, and they had a reputation for providing a very calm atmosphere. Women were good at creating a home away from home, and they were accepted in this role. Even as a single woman, you were accepted in the role as an innkeeper. So whether you were a widow, weren't married, whatever the situation was, it was perfectly acceptable in the society for you to have that as a way to make money. And at that time, there was an integration of home and work. There were no spheres. You know how we say we work inside the home or outside the home? It was not like that. There was no barrier. Everything that was to do with work was home, and home was work, and you did it 7 days a week. And there was opportunity. They could either apply to rent a landowner's inn, or they could just open their own door and do what they do and accept money for that. So let's just quickly meet Janet McLaren. So Janet and I have a lovely relationship. She's been dead a long time. But I have to admit that the second time I went to visit her book, which you're seeing here, I did sort of hug it a little because, you know, I feel like I have a connection to her now. Janet McLaren was an innkeeper at Amory Inn, at least 1832 to 1835, possibly longer. And the book that's here is very significant. It's very significant because it's in a female's hand. There are not a lot of primary sources where the women were writing. This is an accounting waste book. So it's kind of her notes before she would put it into a real accounting book for the bookkeeper or accountant. And I've spent many, many hours. It exists at the Edinburgh, at the National Archives of Scotland in Edinburgh. Spent many hours. Many hours Janet and I have spent together. Here is Amory Inn. The top picture is 1910. You can actually see stabling. Can you see the word stabling above Amory Hotel? Amory Hotel, that was in 1914. That's in 1910. The one below is 1914. Same location, 2014. The one on the right. Same location in September. So I was at the Amory Inn in September, and it's undergoing renovation. Can you see the hotel, where the hotel sign is on the right-hand side? Those are the barns. They're really in poor shape. But I was there, and that is the place that she was an innkeeper with her husband Joseph, who was previously an innkeeper in Crieff, which is just south of there. They rented the inn through Lord Breadalbane, who we saw the picture of earlier. And not long after moving in and starting to operate the inn, Joseph died, and Janet was left to run the inn by herself as a widow. So let's look at Janet's days, which were really full. This is what she did. She rented horses to travelers. Remember we talked about that earlier, about changing stages? She hired men to work in her hayfield. So just think about that as a woman, hiring men and being in charge of them to work in their hayfield. There's interesting social dynamics there. She bought bread from the local baker. So I don't think she maybe made her own bread. She definitely brought, 5, 6 loaves at a time from the local baker. She sold whiskey to road construction workers. So clearly there was road construction that was happening. We talked about earlier with Thomas Telford and his roads. There were also Wade's roads as well at the same time. She lent cash to locals. So inns were a form of retail bank. So when we go to hotels and we go into the ATM and then we pay $5 to get our $20? Okay, it's exactly like that, probably. But people could go in, and if she knew you, Janet knew you, she would lend you money. And so just like stores were often local banks, so were inns at that time. And it was a way of getting cash out into the community. She sold feed to horse dealers and sheep to market sellers. So she had a fully functioning farm. And she offered breeding services of her boar at 5 shillings per sow. So you can see how varied her business was, right? It was not just about providing beds to travelers. It was not just about providing meals or providing whiskey. It was actually a lot more than that. So, what does all this mean anyways? What it means, based on the research that I've done, is that rural women were entrepreneurs as well, just like urban women, just like their counterparts. And often the research in the past has shown that rural women had to wait for things to happen to them. And I would counter that argument and say, based on all of this innkeeping research that I've been doing for innkeepers specifically, they were entrepreneurs. They didn't sit and wait. They created things, they developed relationships to make their community sustain, basically. Their response resulted in a highly commercialized economy as a result. They were valuable and, in fact, critical members of their community. So just think about it, right? If you're the innkeeper and you have all these relationships and you're getting bread from here and stabling a horse there and asking for a guide here and printing off brochures there, just like we have today, an inn is an incredible hub of economy, right? It's an incredible hub. It creates opportunity. So they became very valuable and, in fact, very critical to the health of their rural community. They had agency, impact, and status. Really big words for women. They had agency, impact, and status. And in fact, I've seen, even in writings, where women had, as innkeepers, had a better spot in church than the rest of the women. It's very significant. And they managed complex commercial operations that, in this case, set up the framework for tourism and hospitality. So this time, 1790 to 1840, was prior to railways coming in, prior to tourism just exploding. So they set the framework for what was to come. So that was yesterday. That was the past. And just like we looked at Jarlath, or we're looking at this, or something like that, we got to pull it to the front. So what does that mean for us today? How can we use that? We can use it certainly looking at particular opportunities for destination development and sustainability in this country. Other countries too, but certainly there's an immediate application here. Through tours. In tours, there are a lot of those inns that I was talking about that's still in existence today. Almery, Crieff, like I mentioned, Golspie is another one. Golspie has like the really cool illicit whiskey distilling sort of history. And it actually, the inn exists. I've been there, I've met the owner. There's opportunity there. Foodie culture, authentic recipes. There's a lot kind of pulling us back into that, not 100-mile diet, that's probably over now, but the whole just, unpacking our food, getting rid of the sauce, getting back to nature. Opportunity for museum exhibitions in Cromarty, which is an area in Scotland. There are a significant number of female innkeepers. If the Cromarty Museum was to do an exhibition, it was perfect. I could give them all kinds of information. Even exhibitions on women at work or innkeeper experience, anything like that from a heritage perspective would be easy to do based on this research. Obviously, there's an ancestry tourism connection there with Scotland. And a really interesting way that dawned on me in the course that I'm running right now called Industry Analysis, it really allows me to help people understand what hotel management is all about by really stripping it back and talking about horses and food and travelers. It simplifies everything. So it's a great learning opportunity for my students. And there's research opportunities too. It got me to think about what's the changing impact on hotels in the local economy, rural, urban communities. What about business women's associations and the development of associational culture? What about food, preparation techniques? We talked a bit about that, back to the earth. And then just looking at organizations and women in hospitality in general. Is there an opportunity there to sort of fill in the blanks and then come up with, what is it like today? Maybe a lot of that research has already been done. I'm sure you can think of other ideas and other applications. But those are just some of the things that sort of popped into my head. So that's the end of the formal presentation. But if you have 5 minutes, I'm going to tell you a story. Some of you may have to go, and that's totally fine, because it's 10:02. This is a story of something that happened to me in September. I call it family trees, grave sites, and tromping around in wellies. So if you go to Scotland in the summer, you wear clothes like this, and you wear boots. I've always brought my gloves. It's cold, tends to be. Anyways, I was in Glenlivet in September, in September, and I was at, my family's there, and I was at their kitchen table, and I have a cousin who is really into family genealogy. She's not a historian, but she just loves family stuff. So we sat down, and she was taking me, she knows I love this kind of stuff, so she was taking me through all the family trees, and I'm like, oh, this is so great. And then she turned to me and she said, you know, what did you do your master's dissertation in? And I said, oh yeah, well, Innkeeping, Highlands and Islands, 1790 to 1840. And she said, oh, well, you had a female innkeeper in your past. I was like, what? It did not even dawn on me that maybe perhaps in my own family I might have someone like this. She said, oh yes, you do. Yeah. There, Flora Bella. This says all one name. It's actually two names. Her name, I've discovered it's Flora. Bella is her middle name. She's right there. And she said to me, you know, we've never actually gone to see her grave, but I know where it is. It's not that far from here. Do you want to go? I'm like, yeah, I totally want to go. So we jumped in the cars, like 7 of us. We got into 2 cars, bombing down, you know, the Highlands, whatever, get to the church, and we spread out. So here's the church and the gravesite. We spread out, and we were looking for Flora Mackay. She was innkeeper at Craighead Inn, which was not that far from Glenlivet. She was born in 1890, which was 100 years after the start of my research. So I was like, whoa, stars align. She died 23rd of June, 1961 at the age of 71. And she was a female innkeeper. She was an innkeeper. So we went to the gravesite, and my family spread out, and they're looking at me, okay, what do we do? You know, just get this over with. And they spread it, and I said, we're looking for Flora Mackay. And then I thought, wouldn't that be neat if I found her? Sure enough, I was the one who found her out of all the gravestones, which is really cool. And so here's her gravestone right there in the top left, Flora Mackay. And that's a picture of Craighead Inn. Afterwards, we went to Craighead Inn. It doesn't actually exist as an inn anymore. A family lives there. But when we were at the gravesite, we did a grave rubbing. And we only had a crayon, a kid's crayon, because we have a little cousin who's like a year and a half or so. And here's the grave rubbing. I actually made my husband and my cousin do it because I was having problems getting it to look good. So they, you know, did the, okay, let's do it. If you do it fast, we can leave. So that's what they did. And so that's her, Flora Mackay. And then I had a picture taken with her gravestone. So it was really just a moment for me to go, you know, this is totally real, this is totally true, this completely happened. And just to bring it back to today, I think it really influences my view of women's history in Scotland. It influences my view of women entrepreneurs and the complexity of hotel management. So thank you so much for today. Questions?
I have a question.
Sure.
When can we organize the tour?
Oh, anytime!
I want to go whiskey drinking.
Let's go! I would so be there. I'm serious. Research tour.
Well, I'm in.
Bill's gone. I can't ask him for the money, but you know. But yeah. Any other questions?
Fantastic. Stand over there so I can tweet this out with people in the foreground. Question for you. Did they ever come to any kind of co-op? I know we were thinking association, but I wonder if they ever got any kind of co-op thing moving along, like in the sense of the women working together for better economies of scale or bartering. Or
such a good question, Laura. Like, yeah, really good question, because you would think that, right? We see that through associational culture and men, right? They had business groups that got together, and they got together at inns, ironically. It's, you know, the largest building in a township would be the inn, usually, or the church. And so we definitely see that on the male side. I didn't find any of it on the women's side. It doesn't mean it didn't exist. Cromarty is a good example of that. That area had 4 or 5, I think, female innkeepers. It's a relatively speaking small geographical area. So it would make me think, my assumption would be that they probably leaned on each other for support. I would have loved, like, part of my hope was that I would find that kind of associational bond. I didn't, doesn't mean it doesn't exist, and I think it probably does. Just haven't seen it yet.
Do you plan on taking this another step further, or does it stop here and start something else, or does this inform anything in the future that you want to work on, or do you have any idea with students doing any research on this, or any piece of this that fits for the future for us?
That's a really good question too. I don't know at this point, only because I haven't decided. I'm doing a journal article, so when I submitted my dissertation, it's triple marked and it came back and they said you need to publish this because the research doesn't exist and you've discovered stuff that no one else has in this area. And so I was very humbled by that and I was all excited, and then the work hits and you've actually got to take that thing and get it into a journal format, which is a whole other thing. So I'm doing that. I'm going to submit it this weekend. So that's the next part of it. I would love to continue doing this. I've got a lot of other interests though, so that's where I'm kind of not quite sure what I'm going to do beyond that. Certainly though, the data that I have on innkeepers and food, if there's anybody out there who wants to do anything with that, I would be happy to share it. There's a lot there that could go somewhere. Ryan?
That was fascinating. It's really, really interesting. After this particular period, railways went into Scotland and it became a very popular middle-class destination. At that time, there was a huge investment of hotels being built in Scotland. And I wondered if there was any evidence of who was involved in actually setting those hotels up and making that transition from this particular era into the next one, which was a profound expansion, and there was huge, huge investment went in from a whole bunch of different entrepreneurs.
Mm-hmm. I didn't look closely past 1840, but based on what I saw in the 50-year time period previous to that, I would say landowners had a huge hand in that for sure, because they had the capital. I have seen evidence of even, it's like those Sears model homes. Remember those homes used to be able to order through, like, yeah, you know what I mean? Mail order. They would create an inn, dismantle it, and then basically ship it into the Highlands to be rebuilt. The Strontian Inn, I think, is one of them that was like that. So they're the ones who had the capital to be able to do that. So my assumption is past 1840, that would have continued. I also saw within the time period that I looked at, consortium, a little bit more urban oriented than rural, but a consortium of business owners, men. One in particular close to Inverness, that they pooled all their money and then built inns that way. So, you know, you needed the infrastructure and the money to be able to do that, and so my assumption is at that time period it would have been that. The other piece that I would also assume is through the transportation networks. So when steamships like the Henry Bell's Comet was coming in for public transportation, you know, they'd stop at a port. Well, if there was no inn there, that's kind of a drag, because you're letting all these people out off the boat with no place to stay, and there walks away all your money, right? So they would build inns at the ports where their ships would land. So I would assume then that the same thing past 1840 would happen as well in terms of railways. The railway companies would build them, my assumption would be. Same with steamships and other things through the ports. Yeah. Yes.
On your map, you were showing like all the locations with, you know, women being innkeepers. There was a lot of dots that weren't. Do you know like what the ratio of male to female owners of inns or
no,
inns are?
That's a good question too. No, I don't, because I started just to track women and then just looked at it from a women's perspective. But certainly it was over 1-to-1. So for every one, you know, if I had to guess, somewhere in the ballpark of 2-3 men to 1 woman that I saw, but I think that's a bit of a shaky guess. Looking at them both, though, would be a very interesting comparison, for sure. Yeah, and there some of the areas where there weren't women, because there were no inns there. So it was like there wouldn't have been a man or a woman, because there just was nothing. In the very northern part of the mainland of Scotland, for example, in Tongue, which I've been to, that's a funny name, there was only 1 inn. There's nothing else around it. So yeah. Vivian.
So you mentioned the range of different kinds of travelers, some business people, blah, blah, blah. So the people like Mrs. What's-Her-Name with her lily white sheets, the tourist people that were traveling.
Yeah.
Like, what did they do? Like,
When they got there?
yeah.
Yeah, that's a good question. The tourist people who were leisure, on their leisure
the
time.
leisure stuff.
Right, yeah, not the working.
Walks in their wellies, or what they do?
Actually, they did, because there was this real fascination with nature. It was very, with the literature that was out, the books that were out that I was talking about earlier with Sir Walter Scott, there was this fascination with the awe of nature and the expanse of it, and how scary yet and intimidating yet intimate it was all at the same time. That was very much a way of thinking at that time. So they were there to see the natural hillside and natural countryside. The other part that they were there for was they wanted to see what they were reading about in these books. They wanted to see that replicated in the Highlands and Islands. And often what the books were talking about was not unlike Outlander. So this sort of, you know, gorgeous, hunky men with kilts on wandering the hillside. They thought that they called them the savage beasts, to be honest. That's what they called them. And so they wanted to be able to see that. What is this? It was like an other. You know, there's me and I know what I'm all about, says the English person, or the traveler. But I'm coming to see this something different, this strange being, this beast, this, you know, hair flying in the wind kind of, and that just it still doesn't exist. Like it didn't exist then really. But yeah, so that's what they were looking for too. They were really looking to recreate those experiences that they were reading about in the literature that was popular in the day. Early glamping, yes.
And the music, like you started the session today with the music.
Yeah, the music, yeah, there was, I see a lot of evidence of entertainment. You know, and that started, and it's interesting because there was this travelers having dinner and then wanting that entertainment piece. But there was also this overlay of we should recreate what they're expecting. So there was talk about waiters being in sort of disheveled tartan stuff, and you know, just to kind of, you can imagine, right, a little kitschy, but that's what the travelers want, so get out there, you know, right? So you can kind of imagine that. So there was a little bit of...
Uniform plan right now.
Yes, exactly, uniform.
I know, we put them in baseball uniform.
Exactly.
What?
Yeah, because that's what travelers expect. They expect to see that, so therefore, it's like when you go to into Scotland and they do the Scottish show, you know, because, yeah, if you're going there, that's what you want to see. People dancing in kilts and stuff. So it's exactly the same thing. Yeah, very much so. Yeah.
Thank you so much,
Thank
Theresa.
you. Thank you for coming.